When we look at the Gospels, it looks very similar to other gods we have. For example, we have biographies written of Romulus. We have the kind of like the Gospels of Hercules. We have essentially something very similar to the Gospels written about Aesop. These are non-existent people, and they have whole elaborate biographies written about them. We have a similar thing in the Old Testament, where Moses, it's pretty widely agreed in mainstream scholarship today that Moses is a mythical person. He did not originally exist. Exodus and Deuteronomy are essentially gospels that were fictionally written about this guy. It's where people were constantly inventing myths and stories and biographies of non-existent people. When we look at something like the Gospels that are full of supernatural and ridiculous events, because they look too much like the same thing we get for other non-existent deities. Is to use the Gospels, you have to establish that there's at least one passage that says something about an earthly Jesus that you can establish as more likely true than not. And I have failed to find anyone who's been able to make a sound argument in that way. The closest they can get is 50-50. Paul never references Jesus having a ministry. Again, never references him picking disciples, never references him being a miracle worker. In fact, it denies it by saying that Jesus divested himself of all divine powers and becoming the equivalent of a human slave. In 1 Corinthians 15, there's no reference to Jesus having disciples or picking disciples. Paul never refers to the word disciple. It's not in his epistles. He only knows about people who saw Jesus after he died. You look through all the epistles of Paul, there's no reference to Jesus having a ministry. There's no reference to Jesus being a miracle worker. There's no reference to disciples, and no clear reference to Jesus being on earth. Every single time there is a reference to something like him being crucified or dying, or being buried, we don't know whether he's referring to the earth or the heavens, and therefore we have to look at the context to understand which it might be. When you look at Philippians 2, for example, where Jesus descends and becomes human, this doesn't contradict my theory at all. In fact, this actually matches it. God manufactures a body out of Davidic flesh, and in the epistles, 2 Peter is widely recognized by experts today to be a forgery, and it was written in the 2nd century, and it's responding to Christians who were preaching stories about Jesus were cleverly devised myths. And he says, no, they weren't cleverly devised myths, because we actually saw Jesus, and then it immediately forges an eyewitness testimony to having seen and met Jesus. So we do have testimony to there being a sect like this that actually thought. We have the ascension of Isaiah, we have 2 Peter, and we have Irenaeus, who Paul, all throughout his letters, only ever refers to Revelation and Scripture as his only sources. He never refers to human testimony. In Romans 16, he says the gospel is only known through revelations and Scripture. In 1 Corinthians 15, he only references Scripture and visions. And so we go through all the text, and every single time, even in Galatians, Paul goes out of his way to insist that he didn't learn it from human tradition. To be an apostle, you had to have a vision of Jesus and learn the gospel directly from Jesus. But to him, this meant visions of Jesus, and he seems to have no other idea of how you would know Jesus. So when he does go eventually, finally, years later, to go meet the original apostles who started the cult, there's no reference to him checking his facts against their eyewitness testimony. He doesn't talk about that. All he does is corroborate that his gospel is compatible with their gospel, and as we know from 1 Corinthians 15, all this gospel came by the same method through revelations of Jesus. So there's no thing here that actually connects us with any kind of historical ministry. Paul never references it. It's not there. Even when we get to 1 Corinthians 2, when we talk about the rulers of this age, those are actually the archons of this aeon. Actually a highly bizarre phrase to use, and one that Paul never uses of secular powers. For example, he calls Satan, or one passage says that Satan is the god of this world, for example, and we know archons was a common reference, a common term for demons. Never says the Romans did it, he never says the Jews did it. Even in 1 Thessalonians 2, which was referenced here, that is widely agreed in the field to be an interpolation. Paul never wrote that. Yeah, Richard Purvo has written one of the leading commentaries on Acts, the Hermeneia series commentary. Also wrote a book called The Mystery of Acts, which really exposes what's going on in Acts. But I'll give you an example of why we can't trust that. The idea that Luke was a companion of Paul only appears about 100 years later. It's a later legend that someone came up with. We actually have no evidence of that. Luke, the author, never says he was a companion of Paul, never says he got his information from Paul, or anything like that. But what he does do is completely contradict the eyewitness testimony of Paul. Luke is lying about what happened. And so I don't think we can trust someone who's going to distort history that way. We can't trust that they're telling anything else true in that document. Interestingly, you bring up the Toledoth Yeshu, which is an expansion on what's in the Talmud, because both of those documents place the execution of Jesus in 75 BC, 100 years before Pontius Pilate came into power. And in fact, when you look at the Babylonian Talmud, the Jerusalem Talmud, which was written in the Roman Empire, has no mentions of Jesus or Christianity, or no mentions of Jesus anyway. The Babylonian Talmud does, but they all are references to a Jesus that died in 75 and was executed by the Greek authorities, or the Greek and Jewish authorities. Actually, it was the Jewish authorities, it says. And in Joppa, not in Jerusalem, that he was stoned and then hung up, not crucified in the Roman fashion. That seems to be the only version of Christianity they're aware of.
You know, a good popular introduction might be Bart Ehrman's book, Did Jesus Exist? Unfortunately, it's not a scholarly treatment like Dr. Carrier's, but it's one that's there. I guess the only thing you and I are going to agree on in this debate is that there really isn't a scholarly treatment of the issue from the historical view.
Yeah, I've been trying to rattle some cages and get someone to make one. I'm kind of like fingers crossed. There's one particular notable biblical scholar who's talked about possibly writing a defense of historicity in a very scholarly way, and I really hope he does, because I want to have the ability to say, read my book, read his, come to your own judgment.